Okay, here we are, part 2 on Unit 9. We're going to talk about deeds. This is the actual written instrument that conveys title. It's like a bill of sale. There are two parties to a deed. The grantor, that's the seller, the owner giving ownership title to the buyer, and the buyer is the grantee, the new owner receiving title. You've got to have quite a few bits and pieces on a deed. We're just going to go through some of these. The first part of the deed is the premises section. Basically, this warranty deed is made on this date between the seller, the grantor of this address, and the buyer of this address. And I bargain and sell this property to the grantee, the buyer, for this consideration. And we're looking at a true deed. And this is the premises section. Then we have other sections, the legal description. We've got to have a legal description and any deed restrictions and easements, any appurtenances, which includes things that are attached to the property legally, not necessarily physically, like a boat dock or a parking spot, or even the right to use a particular easement, and the type of ownership that we're transferring. Let's have a look at legal description. There it is. There's the legal description. That's taken from the previous deed, not necessarily from the tax records. Any deed restrictions and easements. If there are any deed restrictions, this is where it would go. Appurtenances, including boat dock, parking spots and stuff like this, together with all tenements, hereditaments and appurtenances thereto belonging or in otherwise pertaining or appertaining to this property. What type of ownership you're getting. This is the habendum clause, fee simple or life estate, for instance. This says the to have and to hold, the same in fee simple forever. Then we have a covenant. This is a promise, or it is a promise basically of season. I promise that I own the land, fee simple, and I can legally sell it. And here it is at the bottom of the deed. And the grantor hereby covenants with the buyer that the seller has lawfully seized the land previously in fee simple, and he has the right and lawful authority to sell the land. On the general warranty deed, we also have some covenants added on to it, which makes it the best type of deed there is, general warranty deed, because you have covenants against encumbrances, further assurance, inquiry, enjoyment, and warranty forever. Basically, it says the seller assures the buyer that the land is free and clear of any liens and restrictions, etc. Those are the encumbrances. And the seller will provide any documents to make the title good. That's further assurance. And the seller guarantees that no one else will come along and claim ownership. In other words, they can enjoy the ownership quietly, quiet enjoyment, and the seller promises this forever. And there it is actually on the deed there. And then finally, we have to have some signatures. The important point to remember here is there's only the seller and two witnesses, so that it can be recorded as constructive notice, and a notary. Notice the notary, Joshua Collins here, and there's Joshua Collins here as well, is one of the, actually, or maybe not. But anyway, the notary can be one of those signatories. For a deed to be valid, though, and this is an important point, for a deed to be valid, it's got to be in writing, has to have the name of the buyer and the seller, the grantor and the grantee. The grantor, that's the seller, has to be legal capacity. It doesn't say anything about the grantee. 18 plus, or 18 or plus. And saying not drunk, consideration described. Now, on the consideration, if we go back, we'll see that we don't necessarily put down the sale price. That's got nothing to do with anybody. Mind your own business. So we put down a nominal fee here of $10, not the actual sale price. In Florida, the tax regulations do insist that you do include the actual amount paid in the transaction on the property records. But on the deed, that's not necessary. granting clause, addendum clause, legal description, and it's got to be signed. Now that makes the deed valid, but for the conveyance to actually take place, the deed has got to be voluntarily delivered and accepted for the ownership to change. Okay, and remember, it's not signed by the buyer or the grantee. Look at this, there's nowhere on here for the buyer or the grantee to sell. In other words, the proof of ownership is going to be the deed. I am in possession of the deed, just like you would be in possession of a bill of sale if you bought a lawnmower from your next door neighbour or something. And that is your proof of ownership, because I have got the bill of sale, I've got the deed that shows that it was transferred to me. There are other types of deed, special warranty, where the grantor, this is the seller, did nothing to encumber or cloud the title during the seller's ownership, but he doesn't make any promises about what happened before he bought it or received it. And it's usually used by developers, banks selling foreclosed homes. Then we have a bargain and sale deed. Very straightforward. Listen, I'm selling you this property. I have the legal ability to sell it, and this is the type of ownership I'm handing over to you, but I don't promise anything in the future. I've no idea what happened in the past. And generally, I say it's used into family land deals where they don't want the whole kebab doing. Statutory deeds. Yeah, that's all Simon. Quit claim deed, we call this. A quit claim deed. The grantor quit claims to the grantee all of the grantor's rights. This provides the least protection for the grantee. In other words, what we're saying here is I may own it, I may have an interest in it, but I'm not interested anymore. Therefore, I'm just signing everything that I've got, if I have it, over to you. And it's used to clear clouds on titles, maybe unpaid or liens that have been paid but haven't been cleared in the records, or maybe an ex-spouse is still on the ownership documents on the current deed, and we need to get his or her name removed. And we have special purpose deeds for someone who is personal representative when you're dealing with a dead person's estate. A guardian deed if the person selling the property is under 18. And as a committee, if there's no one to act on behalf of a person who is legally incompetent, maybe a person in a nursing home who can't make her own decisions. And then there's a tax deed, which is when a person will receive ownership of a property after it's been sold at a tax court. We talk about government restrictions, police power. It's not really police power as in cops and robbers, but what it is local government and state government, and they have the broadest power of government to limit property owners' rights by zoning, building codes, health ordinances and so forth. And we got eminent domain, which they can come along and take the property away from you. Remember, these are government restrictions. And taxation, property taxes are taxed at state level, not at local level. And we have private restrictions. Got a bit of a memory aid here, DELL. We have deed restrictions, easements, leases and liens. Let's just look at those quickly. Deed restrictions are part of a deed. They only affect one particular property, where the restrictive covenants, often recorded with a plat map, affect all the properties in a subdivision. So here's an example of restricted covenant. Let's suppose this is a mini subdivision here. All of these properties will have the same restrictions placed on them, and it may be how many cars are parked outside, height of your fence, the colour of your frontage, and stuff like this. Whereas deed restrictions are just part of a deed and only affect one particular property, nothing to do with the others. Easements, this is the right to use, not live on or occupy or put anything on it, the right to use a portion of the owner's land for a specific purpose, but it does not convey ownership. And we've got quite a few different types. This is an example here where a lot has been maybe divided into two lots, lot A and lot B, but when they made lot A out of the big lot, the owners of lot A house couldn't get to it because the lake at the back and the forest at the front. So an easement through lot B was granted or ordered by court. If it was ordered by court, then that would be by prescription or by necessity, beg your pardon, by necessity. And we call it an easement appurtenant because appurtenant means whatever's going on here affects the property next to it. So by necessity is court ordered, but then if someone had been using this easement for a long time, maybe my father used to own lot B and for many years, and the owner of lot A always used the front field to get to his property. And if it's more than 20 years or more, then that may be an easement by prescription, where the owner of lot B now cannot prevent lot A from using it. So, and also we have encroachment, unauthorized use of another's property with real property, fence or garage located beyond boundary, implied easement after 7 years. Here's an example. Now, supposing we actually do a survey and we see that the survey line reveals that the actual plot line or the boundary is right here, we can see that this garage has been encroached upon the next door neighbour's lot. If this continues for 7 years or more, then the owner of this garage may actually be able to keep it there permanently. And this is called encroachment, and it's an implied easement after 7 years. Leases. We do have different types of leases. Thing about a lease is if you're not owning, if you're living in a place and you don't own it, then you're probably leasing it. Therefore, grants right of possession, does not transfer ownership, obviously, to the tenant, must be in writing to be enforceable if over 1 year. Also requires signatures of 2 witnesses if over 1 year. They've got a funny thing about leases over 1 year. Licensees may use fill-in-the-blank lease forms only approved by the Florida Supreme Court. You can't draw up your own, and you cannot use something which has been drawn up by somebody else that hasn't been approved by the Supreme Court. We've got different types of lease. Gross lease is a typical one that we would use when we were renting out an apartment. The owner, the landlord, pays all the bills that maybe except electricity. Then we have a net lease on commercial buildings, warehouses and so forth. Basically, the tenant pays a fixed rent per month plus building expenses, taxes and insurance and assessments. Then we have a percentage lease. A tenant pays base rent and percentage of gross sales received above a certain amount. Variable lease, where the rent is set to an index. And then we have a ground lease, not so common here, but in Europe very common, where you can lease the land and do anything you want on the land up to maybe 99 years. Let's have a look at percentage lease in the book. They say here, for instance, the base rent is $1,000 a month, and you're going to pay 3% on anything above $325,000. The actual sales are worth $457,000. What is the total rent? Therefore, we take one from the other, and then we have $125,700, which is subject to the 3% surcharge. $3,700. We've got 12 months at $1,000 per month. Then that makes a $12,000 per year base rent, and therefore the total rent is going to be $15,771. A variable lease is when it's fixed to an index. Here's an example in the book where we had a base rent of $12 per square foot, and the current index, or the old index, was 1.5, and then the index moves to 1.8 at the end of the year. So what are we going to charge the new rent? Basically, you get the new index, you divide it by the old index, and you multiply it by the old rent. Very simple. Probably the simplest bit of math in the book. When we have a lease, we can, if the lease allows it, I can assign it to somebody else, or I can sublet it or sublease it out. Assignment is when I actually assign all of the lease property for the remainder of the lease to somebody else. I may still be responsible for the payment or making sure it gets paid, or I may not, depending on how the assignment is written. Or I can actually sublease it. There's 2 ways to sublet a property. Tenant assigns a portion of the lease property. For instance, a student sublets out a room to another student in the home that he's rented. Or a tenant assigns all property for less than the remaining term. In other words, tenant sublets all of the property from April to September. And it could be a combination of that. Liens. when somebody owes us some money associated with a property, I can go along and have a lien put against that property, and eventually I can force the owner to sell the property to pay off the money he owes me. We have the right to have a debt satisfied by some property owned by the debtor. The lien holder, the lienor, may have the property sold to pay off the debt. Liens are recorded in the public records through constructive notice. Liens are called encumbrances. In other words, they're sort of encumbrances or restrictions because we don't want necessarily to have a lien on our property. It makes it harder to sell or impossible until it's paid off. Other encumbrances include easements, deed restrictions, government regulations. We have voluntary liens and involuntary liens. A voluntary lien is like a mortgage from a bank. You voluntarily take a mortgage from the bank and on the understanding that they will please place a lien on the property. And they can force you to sell the property if you don't pay your mortgage payments on time. Vendor's lien from the seller who is financing a purchase. The same as from a bank, but in this particular case it's called a vendor's lien, and it's from the seller who is financing the purchase. And then we have involuntary liens. We have judgment liens when, let's just have a quick look at these here. A judgment lien is against all your personal and real properties. An IRS lien, if you haven't paid your taxes, will be against all of your personal real properties. And we also have federal estate tax liens, death tax. Then we have specific liens. These are specifically against a particular property, like property tax liens, special assessment for that property, a mortgage on that property, a vendor's lien, and a construction lien. These are only applicable, these are called specific, against one particular property. Lien priority, when the property goes into foreclosure or when it gets sold, how are these liens paid off? Here's something you must remember. There are 3 superior liens, and these are always paid off regardless of anything else. The property tax, if property taxes are due, they have to be paid off. If there's a special assessment, then that has to be paid off. We cover special assessments a bit later. And federal estate tax at death, that's got to be paid before anything else. Then if there's any money left over, then we look at the junior liens, which is probably the mortgage, lien, and others underneath it. And these liens take priority by the date in which they were recorded, except for a construction or mechanics lien, which dates back to the time when the materials or labour was first provided. So the junior liens aren't necessarily in any order, but usually the mortgage is the first because that usually happens at closing when you take out a loan to purchase a house. And that's the end of part 2. Thanks very much, and we'll go on to Unit 10 next. Thank you.